as we worked on getting some technological things sorted out. I want to make you aware that you do have an opportunity to ask questions in the chat box as we go along through today's webinar. We will have a few designated times to take questions, at one point through the middle of the webinar and then again at the end, but you are welcome to post questions as we go along in the chat box, and we will be able to see those. Another little housekeeping item, we are going to be delivering to you a survey to get some feedback and some registration information for you. This helps us not only in getting feedback and how effective our webinars are, but it also helps us in some of our grant reporting requirements. So we really greatly appreciate if you can take just a few moments. They're very short surveys to fill those out either throughout the presentation when you might have a moment, or at the end you'll see that survey come to you in an email following up this webinar as well. So with no further ado, we're going to get started. Again, my name is Melanie Houston. I work for the Ohio Environmental Council. I'm the Director of Water Policy and Environmental Health here at OEC. I work on many issues related to this topic here today of fracking or shale gas drilling, along with working to build an environmental health program here at OEC. And just for a full disclosure, right from the beginning, want to let folks know that here at OEC we do continue to call for a moratorium on fracking, but having said that, we are also working on a day-to-day basis to strengthen both laws and regulations on this industry. So I'm very happy to have with us today two very expert speakers who are working on this issue as well, and who have a greater depth of knowledge than myself on this particular topic of fracking waste streams. I have with us Julie Weatherington-Rice and Teresa Mills. First, I'll introduce to you Julie, who will be our first speaker for the webinar after a few intro slides from me. Dr. Julie Weatherington-Rice is a senior scientist at Bennett and Williams Environmental Consultants, and she's also an adjunct professor in the Department of Food, Agricultural, and Biological Engineering at The Ohio State University. Julie has a Bachelor of Science in Earth Science Education, a Master of Science in Geology and Mineralogy, and a PhD in Soil Science, all from The Ohio State University. Her PhD is in the physical and chemical properties of soils and underlying geologic materials. And Julie is working currently with the juxtaposing of shale gas production and public water supplies. Her most current research is centered also on Class II injection wells and the disposal of drilling waste and solid waste landfills. Julie is looking specifically at the chemistry and radioactivity levels of waste from outside Ohio, and you'll get to hear from Julie here shortly. We also have joining us Teresa Mills, and Teresa just brings a wealth of experience with her. Teresa is the Ohio Children's Health Organizer for the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice, and she also works on fracking advocacy for the Buckeye Forest Council. For over 20 years, Teresa has worked as a grassroots leader to assist communities to find their voice, analyze data, and develop strategic plans. She began her career by shutting down the Columbus incinerator that was polluting her neighborhood. This incinerator was later defined as the largest emitter of dioxin in the country. Teresa also founded the Buckeye Environmental Network, which is a statewide grassroots focus group. And today she works with Center for Health, Environment, and Justice to stop schools from being built near toxic land or facilities and other environmental health threats to children. So we're going to move along and just give you a little bit of background information for those of you who may not be aware and know about the Ohio Environmental Council. We hope that many of you do know about our organization, but we're a statewide environmental advocacy organization with 3,000 individual members and 100 group members across the state. Our work includes legislative work, media outreach, public outreach and education, and legal action, among other things. We also have a law center with 3 staff attorneys, And we don't, while we don't do candidate endorsements, we do lobby and take positions on environmental issues. We have 19 staff, which includes attorneys, as I mentioned, as well as policy, development, and administrative staff. And the development folks would love for me to remind you that you can get involved with the OEC and sign up to receive some of our great benefits and become a member of our organization by being in touch with Dina Seco or other folks in the development staff. And you can become a member by going to our website, www.theoec.org. And just a few more background slides. Again, I know we probably have a variety of levels of knowledge on the phone here, but I want to provide for some folks who may not be as familiar with this process just a bit of background on what is hydraulic fracturing. So as with any industrial activity, the development of oil and gas involves risks to air, land, water, wildlife, and communities. And many of you have probably seen these sorts of images depicting the new combination of horizontal drilling with hydraulic fracturing, or the use of sand, water, and chemicals injected at high pressures to blast open the shale rock and release the trapped gas. But what's, I think, always important to note is that while industry will argue in their talking points that this technology has been around for 40 or more years, that's not quite the full truth or the full picture. While the use of hydraulic fracturing to drill vertical wells has been around for some time, using the technique of hydraulic fracturing combined with horizontal drilling is very new and only began in Ohio in 2011. Very brief overview in terms of oversight and regulation here in Ohio of the shale gas or fracking industry. I think it's important to note that our Ohio Department of Natural Resources and their Division of Oil and Gas Resources Management, they are the agency that has the jurisdiction over most, almost all of the activity of this industry. So they do, not only do they do the permitting, but most of the regulations and oversight of this industry happens in that department. So just to note a few of the things that are required right now. So there are notification and reporting requirements during well cementing, well completion, well stimulation, and well production, and also site restoration being required for urban and non-urban well sites. This is, again, a very, very brief overview. In terms of water withdrawal, currently at the latest version of Ohio law requires registration if a facility has the capacity to withdraw 1,000 gallons per day. Now, just to note, again, this is registration. This doesn't necessarily indicate that that there would be enforcement or checking in to make sure that that amount has not been surpassed, but that simply companies must put in their permit applications when they plan to withdraw this amount of water. In addition to Ohio Department of Natural Resources oversight, there are a few areas where the Ohio EPA and Ohio Department of Health get involved. So one example for the Ohio EPA is in terms of air pollution or air emissions. And companies need to get permits to install and operate for units or activities that emit air pollutants. There are most often general permits, but sometimes there are also individual permits. And also things that would relate to waters of the state. So pollutants to waters of the state, wetlands, streams, for example, those would fall under the jurisdiction of Ohio EPA. And then on this topic of radioactivity, which is something we're going to be talking quite a bit about today. We'll be using terms like TENORM and NORM, which stand for NORM, naturally occurring radioactive materials, and TENORM, technologically enhanced radioactive materials. So these are areas where the Ohio Department of Health, has the radiation experts, and under our new budget bill, which has recently been passed for the state of Ohio, there are requirements for not only Ohio Department of Natural Resources and Ohio EPA, but also the Ohio Department of Health to be writing some rules about these recently added provisions to the state budget bill. In addition, we have been told that there are memorandums of understanding or agreements for collaborations between these agencies. We have not seen those documents and do not know to what extent or how specific those agreements are and that collaboration, but we have been told that that should be happening to some degree. So I just want to very briefly go over some basic definitions with some terms that you'll be hearing upcoming in the presentation, and my colleague Julie Weatherington-Rice will go into these to a greater detail and has a much better expertise level with these, but real basically want to point out what are some of these shale gas wastes that we see, these waste streams. So we have brine, which at the and these definitions are most often derived from U.S. EPA. We have brine, which is simply, in its most simple form, a combination of salt and water, but important to note when it comes to shale gas or fracking that this brine often includes other materials like chemicals, heavy metals, and potentially radioactive materials. Flowback fluid, a little different from brine, but it's recovered fracturing fluids that come back up to the surface. You'll also hear this referred to as produced water. Drilling mud or fluid is a mixture of liquids and gaseous fluids and mixtures of fluids and solids that is used to drill into the earth. So this is essentially the mud or the fluid that's used in helping to create that drill bore. And as I noted before, just important to remember, all three of these waste streams are likely to and can include fracking chemicals, heavy metals, and radioactive materials. A couple more terms for you. Drill cuttings refers to rocks and soil that are brought to the surface during drilling activity. And we have an image here depicting some drill cuttings in an open pit. And then pipe scaling, which is the material that builds up, have another image for you here, on the inside of these pipes in the production process. And this material can actually make the inner area of the pipe smaller, which can increase the pressure inside the pipe. We also know that this can be there can be high concentrations of radioactivity. That typically these pipe scalings are considered to be including TENORM or very concentrated, again, concentrated radioactive materials. And the final slide that I'll leave you with some images of impoundments and or open pits. These terms can perhaps be used interchangeably as we understand that impoundments are essentially the same thing as open pits, except that open pits is an older term. It's included all of the unlined pits of the 60s and 70s and before. At this point, everything, though, it's important to note everything that is not fresh water has to be lined. But even with there being liners in these impoundments, that doesn't mean that the linings don't leak. And in fact, my colleague Julie Weatherington-Rice tells me that based on some different scientific models that have been produced, we assume a certain sort of rate of leakage of these liners. And so this really kind of highlights the importance of tanks, frac tanks, storage tanks as a better choice of storage of these materials, which can include some nasty chemicals and radiologic materials. But of course, we also know that there can be issues with these storage containers as well. They can be leaking or have spills in the emptying and or filling process. So nothing is really leak-proof or leak-free, but we wanted to point out to you kind of what these open pits and these impoundments look like. Also important to note that these, although we're being told are not best practice by industry, these are still allowable within Ohio's revised codes, and we've seen a lot of these in Pennsylvania, and so it is still a potential and allowable under Ohio law, and something that we could see here in the state of Ohio. So having gone through some background slides to kind of lay the groundwork for you, we hope that that's helpful. And if you'll give us just a moment, we will transition to our next speaker. Again, Dr. Julie Weatherington-Rice. She's going to go into kind of a much greater depth into some of these issues. And again, you can use that chat box for posting your questions as we go along, and we will keep an eye on that. So Julie, take it over.
Thank you very much. This is exciting to be able to talk to you all this way. I have spent pretty much this year looking at the waste streams because of the fact that we're importing more waste than we're making here in Ohio. And so therefore, since we are net importers of waste, we needed to understand what was in it, where it was going, and what kinds of problems we might have related to where it's being placed and if there was any spillage associated with it. I got involved in this because my firm does a lot of work with public water supplies, especially well fields. And in eastern Ohio, all of the well fields have oil and gas leasing all the way around them, and some of them even have oil and gas wells in the shale underneath them. So this is a daily thing that they have to live with. And because we don't have home rule protection anymore available to local governments, we had to be smart about what the possible risks were and think about how we might put protection in place. So that's really how I got started on this. The first slide I'm going to talk about it has to do with radioactivity. We hear about the radioactivity in the Black Shales and in the brine, but I think one of the things that we need to understand is where does it come from? And it comes from where everything comes from. We are stardust, and so is everything else around us, including the Black Shale. When you look at the universe, from the Big Bang, we got the elements hydrogen through boron. And all the other elements, all the way through the radioactive decay chain, all come from supernovas at the deaths of stars. And when they die, that dust comes out into the universe and eventually coalesces, and in our case, became Earth. And so when the Earth was formed, it was formed with these radiological components to it as well as everything else. So when we look at Black Shale, it's actually naturally radioactive, and this we'll talk about the NORM and TENORM, but it's actually radioactive for two different reasons. Part of the reason it's radioactive is because of the material that the shale is made up from. Shale is a sedimentary rock, and it's essentially clays and organic materials that have washed in off the uplands and washed into either a marine or a freshwater environment. The shales we're talking about are marine. And the Marcellus is Devonian in age. It's about 300 million years old. And it comes from the Appalachian mountain building. That's where the material comes from. The Silurian Utica is older. It comes also from mountain building, but also off of the Canadian Shield. Since the mountain building is igneous rocks, fire rocks, they bring with them radiological material in the magma, and so it gets transferred down to the shale. Now, once it becomes shale, then we have something called bioaccumulation happening. And what does that mean? Well, If you know anything about a water softener, or if you've ever used a Brita water filter on your faucet, essentially what happens is that anything that is carried with water attaches itself, the heavy metals, the radioactive metals, attached to the clay minerals and to the organic material in the shale. And the problem that we've got with the shale is that it's like a filter that nobody recharged over 300 million years. So you've got a whole lot of junk that's attached itself over those years, and it's in the shale itself, or it's in the brine. And so it's just naturally there. And the older the rock is and the higher the carbon content, the more radiation you're going to have. Now, when we're looking at the shale gas waste this year, we did a definition, and we broke it down as Melanie just talked about. We looked at the ground shale rock. We looked at what Ohio was calling it and what US EPA was calling it, because it makes a difference in terms of whether you have to test for it or not. Our ground shale rock, Ohio is determining as NORM, naturally occurring. US EPA calls it TENORM. The drilling muds, everybody agrees that those are TENORMs and those should be tested. Fracking fluid, Ohio says they're NORM, US EPA says they're TENORMs. The brines, the salts, those are NORM by Ohio standards, those are TENORM by US EPA standards. And then we also have drilling waste, site wastes, and other releases. And so when we look at the waste streams, those are the main things that we're looking at. In Ohio, according to the new budget bill, we only have to worry about monitoring the drilling muds, the sludges, and the materials in the scale in the drilling pipe. Everything else is free of any kind of testing or any kind of requirements. Now, how did we get into this confusing state of situations? Well, there's actually 4 national definitions for NORM and TENORM. And Ohio uses the oldest one, the least restrictive one. It's the Conference for Radiation Control Program Directors. It goes back to 1990, which is before shale fracking ever occurred anywhere in the United States. So we were not doing horizontal drilling in 1990 anywhere. This is a new activity since this definition came out. After this definition came out, the US EPA, the National Academy of Science, and ANSI all added a clause to their NORM definition, and they said if there was the potential for increased exposure, which is what happens when you bring this material up from a mile below the earth, then it becomes TENORM and it's subject to testing. Now, why is that important? Well, because there are a couple of numbers you have to remember, and when you look at these numbers versus the real numbers, it'll make you realize why this is important. US EPA cleanup standards say 5 picocuries per gram, and drinking water standards are 5 picocuries per liter. Now, if you go above that, you're no longer clean and it's no longer safe to drink. Those numbers are very low, especially when we start showing you the numbers that are out there. Why are we concerned about these waste streams coming into Ohio? Well, Ohio has this tradition of funding our state and local governments from tipping fees and other sources of money that comes from out-of-state waste streams. We've been doing this for at least 20 years, and we have funded many of our programs from these out-of-state waste. So when there was this explosion of waste coming out of Pennsylvania and West Virginia, it was a new source of revenue for Ohio if they brought it in. And so they went out and essentially solicited and set up Ohio so that they could import these waste streams into Ohio so that they could charge a fee on it to help run the government. But I think the thing that's really important to remember is that Ohio does not have magic geology. It isn't like it instantly can take anything and swallow anything and never have repercussions. But when you look at the way the waste streams are being handled in Ohio, you come from the assumption that it can take everything, but it can't. We're also concerned because black shales are early sources of uranium ore. They were part of the original uranium sources for the atomic age and the Manhattan Project. Black shales are like coals. They're full of heavy and radioactive materials. It's especially the thorium-232 to radium-228 series and the uranium-238 to radium-226 series that are the most common in our rocks. And the radiums and the uraniums are soluble. They're water soluble. They're also in the brines, so they're easily transported to the surface. Now, if these were uranium tailings, and the shale could be used precisely for that, then the cutoff is 5 picocuries per gram because of the radium. Anything higher than that has to go to a low-level radioactive waste landfill, either in Utah or in Washington State. But because we're calling our shale cuttings NORM, we are not held to that requirement. And again, the drinking water is 5 picocuries per liter. Now, where does the black shale look like in terms of everything else? You'll hear people say, oh, it's no more problem than your granite countertop. Actually, it is. It's considerably a higher problem. When you look at this slide from USGS, it shows that our black shales and our coal ashes, which are also highly radioactive, are considerably more radioactive than the granite. And once you start hitting the 100 parts per million number, you've got a uranium ore. So as you can see, black shales run to the gamut, so they start being in the uranium ore levels. We're also concerned about the radioactivity in the brines. We know that New York has got brines that measure up to 15,000 picocuries per liter of radium-226. Remember, the number is 5. Now we're at 15,000. And the scale buildup on the inside of the pipes can be as much as 6,000 picocuries per gram of radium-226 and 2,000 picocuries per gram of 228. So those are TENORM handling. Even Ohio agrees to that. But I think it's important to remember that we still have contamination in Ohio from the Manhattan Project, and we are much wiser than our current administration is giving us credit for in terms of handling these materials. Why is the radioactivity such an issue? Well, it's because the total organic carbon level in the shale is where the oil and gas is found. And so what they do when they drill is they send a piece of equipment called a gamma logger down on a wire, and they look for the very most radioactive parts of the shale. And that's where they put their horizontal drilling, because they're going to get the most oil and gas from that area. So we're not dealing with the average radioactivity of the Utica or the Marcellus. We're dealing with the very most radioactivity of it. And we have a health risk to be considered. And why is it an issue? Well, if you look at this periodic table, you'll see calcium, which you all know are in your bones. What happens, because radium is water soluble, is if you drink it, it will replace the calcium in your bones, and now you have radioactive bones. You also have a problem with lead-210, which also comes out of the radioactive decay chain, and that will also go into your bones. And once they're in your bones, they don't just sit there in that element. They will continue to decay. So now you've got decaying radioactive isotopes in your body. We also find that there's some very high numbers of potassium 40, which is also radioactive, that's showing up in some of the drilling muds. We're not really sure where that's coming from. we are a growth industry for shale waste in Ohio. We've got it coming in by road, by rail, and we're setting up a river barge port already in Washington County. More than 50% of the Class 2 injection well materials that were injected in Ohio last year came from out of state. So we are a net importer, and we are now to the point that we are constructing dedicated out of state Class 2 wells that just simply bring in brine and drilling fluids from out of state. We're not even taking Ohio waste in those. We're just bringing in out of state. One just got put in Athens County. We are having no public hearings at all for anybody for these injection wells or for any of the permitted drilling sites. And if we take New York, if New York goes online and we continue with these ports on the Ohio River, I'm estimating that within a few years, about 80% of the waste stream that we see in Ohio is going to be coming from out of state. So you've got ground shale rocks with drilling muds. Those are going, and those are solid waste, and construction and demolition debris landfills are getting those. There is no record of how much we're getting or where. They're just simply listed as solid waste. They're used as daily covered. They're not necessarily buried, and there's no testing to know how radioactive they are. The fracking fluids and brines are injected into Class 2 wells, except where they're spread on the roads, or solidified and put into the landfills, or some other management process is yet to be determined. It's important to know that ODNR, Division of Oil and Gas Resources, calls all of the shots. EPA and ODH are second in those arrangements. We are really driller friendly in Ohio, and there was a recent article in the Columbus Dispatch quoting drilling companies from around the eastern part of the United States. Randy Albert from Consol Energy said, Ohio is probably the most regulatory friendly state I've operated in. I'm not sure being regulatory friendly is a good thing. Jack Shaner said, to our credit, DNR has tried to get more regulatory power over the industry, but many of the attempts have failed because the majority of the Republicans in the Ohio Assembly have voted against those stronger requirements. So here we are struggling with very, very weak requirements, and with each bill coming into the House and Senate, we're getting weaker, not stronger. Okay, now I'm going to introduce you over to Teresa Mills.
Hi, Teresa. You can go ahead and start now.
Okay, let me start again. Yes, my name is Teresa Mills, and I'm with the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice. And I'm also the fracking coordinator for the Buckeye Forest Council. I'm not sure how to change the slide. Okay, thank you. The first slide you will see gives a brief look at the different types of injection wells that we have in the state of Ohio. The Class 1 wells isolate hazardous and municipal wastes, and they inject them. This picture makes it look like they're very deep, but we have Class 1 wells that are only 2,800 feet down. The second one is the Class 2 wells, which are strictly for the oil and gas waste. Class 3 wells are solution mining. That would be like your salt mining, bringing up salt from underground. Underneath that, you will see the next one is a Class 4 well. Class 4 wells have now been banned because at one time they were injecting hazardous and radiological material either above or directly into our aquifers. So they did finally decide to ban those. Class 5 wells are all other types of injection wells, stormwater injection wells, large capacity septic systems, even sinkholes are considered to be a Class 5 injection well. And then the newest source, or the newest type of well that will probably soon be permitted in the state of Ohio are Class 6 wells, which would be for carbon sequestration. That would be taking the material from coal plants and then injecting them underground. Next. This slide gives you a little idea of where in the strata each of these classes of wells are injected. You can see the Class 1 injection well, again, the hazardous waste, or as defined as hazardous waste, that goes down into or below an aquifer containing over 10,000 parts per million of total dissolved solids. Class 2 are the liquid waste that come from the oil and gas industry. I refuse to call them brine. They're not my grandma's pickle liquor. Class 3 wells are, again, the material that's recovered from salt mines, those type of things. Class 4, again, have been banned, and Class 5, again, are the non-hazardous injection from a deep aquifer. These are also, Class 5 wells can also be aquifer remediation wells. We have almost 6,000 aquifer remediation wells in the state of Ohio. So that means that we already have aquifers that are contaminated, and we certainly don't need to be putting more and more of our aquifers in danger. Next. This slide gives you a little idea of where each of these types of wells may be found. Here in the industrial facility, that would be like your Class 2 injection well going down into sandstone. All of our injection wells are supposed to be in sandstone. Agricultural areas, residential areas, this could be as simple as stormwater runoff going down into an injection well. Material and fossil fuel recovery, this would be your oil and gas. And I really like this slide because it shows you the fractures in the bedrock. Next. Excuse me. Next. Okay. This is a newer type of injection well, not a newer type, but it's a newer injection well that's located in Coshocton County. You can see the different gauges that are on it. These would be the injection pressure and then the annulus pressure. And this is how they decide and determine if an injection well is in compliance with their permits or if there has been a leak that has occurred. Next. Now this is an older type of injection well, and this is what most of our injection wells in Ohio would look like, because the majority of the some 211 permitted injection wells in the state of Ohio are converted oil or gas wells. And that means at one time this injection well was at one time producing either oil or gas, and when it came up dry, then they converted it into an injection well. Injection wells such as this do not have the same type of protection that the newer types of injection wells. They don't have the same requirements for the different levels or the different layers of protection that the new ones offer. Next. Okay, this is kind of your basic injection well 101. The first step is that they drill the surface casing down to a depth of 50 feet below the lowest drinking water aquifer. And then they cement that casing in place. Cement is introduced usually from the bottom up, and it is cement, it is not concrete. mineral additives that serve to seal the casing to the formation formations exposed in the borehole. Next. Then the second step is the long string casing. I think this slide is important because you've seen probably in some of the industry's television ads how many layers of protection they have, 7, 8, 15 layers of protection. Well, this is basically it for our older injection wells. We have a long string casing that's installed within the surface casing. Imagine a pipe within a pipe. The cement plug is drilled out, and that plug would have been when they first cemented in the surface casing. The plug is drilled out, and the drilling continues through the confining zone into the injection interval. Long string casing is installed from the surface to or through the injection zone and is sealed into the drill hole with cement. A lot of people think that injection wells, there's an underground tank or something that's confining this waste. And there's no such thing as a tank underground on these injection wells. Next. Okay, the injection tubing on an old oil or gas well, the production tube is switched over to an injection by just placing another tube down in the production tube. So this is like a rubber liner within your car tire, something on that order. The tubing is the smallest diameter in the well. The tubing is installed within the long string casing, and it carries the inject date from the surface to the injection zone. It's usually constructed of corrosion-resistant steel or fiberglass reinforced plastic, and the tubing is typically for anywhere from 2.5 inches to 7 inches. The largest one I've found in Ohio so far is 4 inches, and I have found one that's as small as 1.5 inches. Now imagine trying to inject millions of gallons of this waste down a 2.5-inch diameter pipe. That's why they have to operate at such high injection pressures. A packer is a mechanical device that's installed on the outside of the injection tubing, and it's to isolate the injected waste from the annulus. The wellhead is seals the gap between the tubing and the long string casing at the top of the tubing. The packer annulus is the space between the outside of the tubing and the inside of the long string casing. The annulus is sealed at the top by the wellhead and at the bottom by the packer. Pressure can be maintained on the annulus and monitored by the injection well operator. Any changes in pressure indicates a leak in the system. This is like I said, this would be like the annulus of your automobile tire. A flat tire indicates a defect either in the tire or the rim. Similarly, monitoring the annulus pressure provides a continuous measurement of the integrity of the injection well. However, it is very, very hard to monitor for small leaks. So you could have a small leak occurring over a long period of time, and it would not be noticeable under these pressure tests. Next. This is just kind of a drawing that I did to kind of give people an idea of the actual size of an injection well. The outer rim is 8 5/8 inches, which is typical for the older types of injection wells. That would be your surface casing, the 8 5/8 inches, and that would go down to 50 feet below the aquifer. The second string or the long string casing, or in an old well, the production casing is 4.5 inches. And then within that 4.5 inches is the 2 3/8 inches, which is now the injection tubing. And if you'll see, there isn't a lot of room around either one of these pipes to be installing very much cement. It's less than a 1-inch radius of fluid around the injection tubing. So the annulus is not filled with cement, the annulus is filled with fluids. And that helps keep the injectate from coming back up into the annulus. Next. This just gives you a little idea of the side view of an injection well. Excuse me. Here would be the surface casing, again down 50 feet below the drinking water source. Here would be the cement casing. This would be considered, this is the long string casing. This is the injection tube. In between the injection tube and the long string casing is the annulus, and this is filled, as I said before, with fluid. This black area here is considered the packard. The packard keeps the waste that's injected here from going right back up into the packer, or back up into the injection well. I kind of got, can you go back 2 slides for me? Another one? There, thank you. And as I said before, here is the injection gauge pressure, and here is the annulus pressure. The injectate goes in this tube, comes down, and goes out. This picture is a little confusing because it does look like there is cement here, and typically there is not. On some of the older wells, there may be, because the well may have been perforated because it was a vertical well at one time. Okay, injection wells are regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act, and that's the main federal law that ensures the quality of Americans' drinking water. The Safe Drinking Water Act was originally passed by Congress in 1974 to protect public health by regulating the nation's public drinking water supply. The law was amended in 1986 and 1996 and requires many actions to protect drinking water and its sources, such as rivers, lakes, reservoirs, springs, or groundwater wells. Supplies, the definition is supplies any public water system or contains a quantity of groundwater sufficient to supply a public water system. The key word in this definition is public. The Safe Drinking Water Act does not regulate private wells which serve fewer than 25 individuals. So in most of our rural communities where they do not have public water supplies, no one is protecting that aquifer. So how did we get to where we are today? In 1974, responding to concerns about the underground injection practices, including failures of some wells, U.S. EPA raised concerns that injected waste could contaminate groundwater, underground drinking water. December of 1974, Congress enacted the Safe Drinking Water Act, which required EPA to set requirements for protecting groundwater sources of drinking water. The U.S. EPA passed the Underground Injection Control Regulations in 1980. In 1988, EPA made its Underground Injection Control Regulations stronger to comply with the newly upgraded waste disposal amendments under the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, or what we call, or you may hear called RCRA. In 1988, EPA also exempted the E&P, which is exploration and production waste, from the oil and gas from requirements under Subtitle C of RCRA. And subtitle C of RCRA is whether a waste is determined to be hazardous or not. In its 1988 determination, EPA admitted that exploration and production waste contained toxic substances that did endanger human health, and they noted that benzene, phenanthrene, lead, arsenic, barium, antimony, fluoride, and uranium found in the waste were a major concern at levels that sometimes exceeded 100 times the EPA health standards, but EPA declined to regulate the toxic substance under subtitle C of EPCRA. EPA issued three factors for their determination not to regulate this waste under RCRA. And those were the infeasibility of implementing alternative regulations, the adequacy of state regulations, and the one that was most troubling to me is the economic harm that would befall the oil and gas industry if additional regulatory controls were imposed. All three of these factors should now be null and void. And I think that's the end of my presentation. So I'm turning it back over to Julie.
Hi, thank you again. We're getting started at this. No, we've gone back. No, I think it's there. Can you get rid of that? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Teresa. Not all materials have to go in, liquid materials have to go into Class 2 injection wells. We have some other options. One of the options right now that's taking place in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio is the recycling of the fracturing fluids themselves. We have several programs that's ongoing, and they're becoming more and more common. Why is this happening? Well, it's because, remember, we're talking about the 5 million gallons per well to fracture, and if we can save part of that water, then you don't have to buy it for the next round. Also, you may be able to recover some of the fracturing chemicals, and so it's actually a savings for the drillers if they've got another well to send it to recycle it. There are, however, some potential problems related to recycling that we have to be aware of. First of all, if you recycle the fluids, you have to filter it. You have to take out the sand and rock cuttings and other things that have been picked up in those fluids before you can reuse it. Right now, those filtered materials go to a landfill, and they are not tested because this is, remember, by Ohio standards, it's NORM. If you reuse the fluid over and over, each time you do, the radium levels, which are water soluble, increase. So each time you reuse it, the water becomes hotter and hotter and hotter. And eventually, the total dissolved solids become so high that you can't really use the water anymore, and at that point it does have to go to a Class 2 injection well anyway. But you have saved a significant portion of the waste stream from going directly to a Class 2 by reusing it. I think it's really important to note that Ohio does not collect any information at all on our recyclers. We don't know who they are. We don't know where they are. We don't know how they collect the fluids. We don't know how they dispose of the waste, any of that. Most of the information we have on recycling actually comes from Pennsylvania, who talk about what they're sending to Ohio recyclers. Probably the most famous or infamous recycling system is the Patriot Water Treatment and Warren, Ohio Wastewater Treatment, the process that they're using at their plant. And essentially what happens is that Patriot takes in the fracking fluids, not the brine, but the fracking fluids, and they're trucked to their facility in Warren. And at this point, They then filter out any of the solids, and the filter cake probably goes to a landfill, and it's blended around and around through a number of tanks, and then it's just simply metered out to the Warren wastewater treatment plant, who then blend it with their sewage and put it through their treatment, but it doesn't do anything about the dissolved solids, and it doesn't do anything about the radiation. And at that point, they just release it to the Mahoning River. Patriot and Warren wastewater treatment plant check for radium, but they use a handheld monitor, which doesn't really give you any information. When we asked who gave them approval to use that monitoring system, EPA said that Ohio Department of Health must have approved it. Ohio Department of Health said, oh no, it must have been Ohio Department of Natural Resources who approved it. Well, last we checked, nobody at Ohio Department of Natural Resources were qualified to approve radiation monitoring or managing a wastewater treatment plant. So at this point, it doesn't look like anybody that was qualified approved it, if anybody approved it at all. So no one knows how much radium is being discharged into the Mahoning River at Warren. Now, dilution works, but it only works up to a certain point. Where this was done in Pennsylvania previously, before they started sending their wastes over here, they were finding that there were radium levels above the cleanup levels in the sediments below the outfall for the wastewater treatment plant. So it is a concern. What we're finding is that the handheld and stationary gamma radiation detectors actually tell us nothing about radium levels. And the reason for that is because radium emits either an alpha or a beta, depending upon which radium it is. 226 is an alpha, 228 is a beta. So they don't emit a gamma. And so you can't just measure it. So what you have to do is take the sediment or the soils or the rock or the flowback water or brine and put it in a jar and seal it up for 21 days at least. And what happens then is that radon, which is a gas, grows out of the radium, and then it grows polonium-218. And what you actually measure is the gamma of lead-214 or bismuth-214. So you're actually measuring the great-granddaughters or the great-great-granddaughters of radium-226. You're not actually measuring the 226 itself. So this is a picture of a decay curve that comes from the Department of Energy, and it essentially shows you if you don't wait long enough, you can't get any kind of an idea of what the loading is. So you cannot do this in the real time. You have to do it in a lab setting, and you have to hold on to the samples for a while. You can repurpose pretty much everything out of the oil and gas brine. Pretty much everything has an industrial application and a current market. We already mine salts out of Ohio for industrial applications. The DOE and GE is working on a process to remove the radiums from the brine. And we already have the technology to break down the oil and gas brines. But the issue now is working on the economics. But if you factor in what it costs you to drill a saltwater well, what it costs you to bring it up, what it costs you to process that, if you saved that money because you were reprocessing the oil and gas brine, that would go some of the distance to making this an economically feasible process. We do have some questions about why would we dispose of these resources when we have other uses for them, and we could still tax, we're getting 20 cents a barrel, we could still tax the out-of-state brine if we reprocessed it here, and if we reprocessed it here, we might actually get some jobs out of this for Ohio. All the solids at this point are going to the landfills, and with the exception of the drilling muds and the sludges, nothing has to be measured for radioactive levels. And the the drilling muds and the sludges can be down blended, mixed with dirt to get them under the 5 picocuries per gram level, in effect diluting that radioactivity. But there's no requirement in the budget bill or anything that's been put together at this point that requires that radioactivity to be chemically bound. And so since it's not chemically bound, it will move out of the material that it's been put into, and it will go into solution and go into the leachate at the landfill. And so then you move it out of the landfill into the leachate. The leachate is collected. It goes to a wastewater treatment plant. They are not equipped to take care of the radiation, and it ends up in whatever the stream is that they're dumping into. Solid waste landfills, construction, demolition, debris landfills are not low-level radioactive waste landfills. We don't have any of them in the state of Ohio that meet our siting requirements and the design requirements. They simply don't do it. There are some good fact sheets online at OSU that explains what you have to have for a low-level radioactive waste landfill, and ours don't look like this, and we're not managing them this way. Michigan is doing something interesting, as is Pennsylvania and West Virginia. Michigan is taking the waste in, but they are putting them into something called a monocell, a separate cell that they have a GPS location on so they know where it is. And they're taking up to 50 picocuries per gram. Well, how long does that site have to be safe? Well, if you use their numbers, for the radium in that monocell to be safe, you have to go another 5,000 years into the future before that will be safe. If you're concerned about the uranium, now you're looking at a half-life of 4.46 billion with a B years. So now you're 3.5 times that. So now you're back to the age of the universe. So you literally have to protect this site till as far in the future as the universe goes back to for its creation. And for thorium, we don't have a number anywhere near this. Now you're at about 45 billion years. We've got nothing that old that we know about. So you're really creating a sacrifice zone that has to be kept separate for all time. In Pennsylvania, they are monitoring everything that comes in, no matter what it is considered NORM or TENORM, and they're using a criteria, and they're keeping it separate. West Virginia now has monocells that they're putting into place. They don't have a criteria for what they have to test, but what they're doing is requiring that the monocell in the landfills have a separate leachate collection system, and that they test that leachate 2 times a month. And they're looking for radiological levels on it. And their position is that this isn't something that they're only going to worry about for 30 years. Their position is they're probably going to have to test these landfills forever. In Ohio, we're just mixing it into the face, and we're just ignoring most of it. There are other solutions to brine disposal that we know for a fact will reach the water. You can use brine in Ohio for de-icing of roads in the winter, and you can use it for dust control in the summer. Excuse me. What happens when that, it either washes into the groundwater or into the surface water, but the heavy metals and the radioactive metals attach to the dust on the road. So then when you drive over the road, the dust then flies into people's yards, onto their vegetable patches, and you translocate those heavy metals, those radioactive metals, into people's property. And that's one reason why this is a really bad idea. We also have folks that just simply dump it down the storm sewers or dump it into the river, and we have a number of those events. We've had at least 3 cases in Ohio since January of companies that have had injunctions against them and are being sued by the state of Ohio for disposal of brine illegally. When we look at the issue of the waste stream, I think one of the things that everybody seems to forget is that the biggest waste that we've got is the waste of the resource itself. I mean, we have been looking at and trying to get oil out of Black Shales since before the 1960s. This is a cover of a U.S. Geological Survey publication for 1960. And in the West, we've started working on it. And one of the problems that they had when they dug up the shale was when they heated it to get the oil out, the clays that were in the shale expanded, blew up like popcorn. And so they had more material after they were done than they had when they started, and they didn't have enough places to put the stuff. So they were looking for other alternatives because clearly they couldn't just dig it out and use it. They tried other things. None of them worked very well. In the 1970s, they actually turned shale areas highly radioactive by setting off atomic bombs, thinking that that would help fracture the shale and be able to pull out the oil and gas. Well, what happened was it turned the shale to glass, and what they did get out was so highly radioactive that nobody could use it. So this idea of hydraulic fracturing is really just the latest attempt to get the oil and gas out. We've been working on this for more than 50 years, and I'm sure that in 5 or 10 years we're going to come up with something else. We just happen to see what they're doing at this point in time. But what's really important to remember is that with all this effort and all this money and all this waste stream, we're still only going to get about 6.5% of the oil and gas that's available in that shale out. The shale wells are notorious for short-time production. If you get 4 years out of them, you're doing really well. Then you have to refrac it, and you go over and over again. And each time there's more waste, and each time there's less coming back out. So we are in the process of fracking these very important mother loads of oil and gas, because this is where all the oil and gas that we've ever gotten comes from. It comes out of the Black Shales. And we may be destroying for all time these resources. We've been down this path before. In the 1890s, the Lima Findlay oil field was the biggest oil field in the entire United States, in the entire world. That's how J.D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil got started. But what happened was, because they were so new to this process, they drilled so many holes in this oil field that they depressurized the entire oil field. And there are estimates that as much as 90% of the oil and gas is still in the ground there. And we cannot get it out because we would have to find all of these old wells. We'd have to seal them up, and we would have to repressurize the field to be able to get it back out. So 120 years plus down the road, we've still got maybe 90% of the source down in the ground, and we can't even get it out because we messed it up so thoroughly when we went for it. So this is one of the big concerns that we've got as we look at this fracturing is, are we in effect going to get only a little bit out and then for all times make it impossible to get the rest out? So it's the waste of the resource that may be the biggest waste that we have to worry about. There are a team of authors from 6 universities and colleges and the private sector that are working on a paper for the Ohio Journal of Science, and it is looking at the drilling of the Utica and Marcellus shales in Ohio. It's what we know, what we don't know, what are some of the environmental and legal issues and controls that are in place, what are the public health considerations and the socioeconomic considerations. This paper should be finished this fall. It will be published online immediately, so I would suggest keeping a track of this website at Ohio State, because once it's ready, it'll be up and available to everybody. if you are doing research on this topic that ought to go into the paper, please, please let me know about it. We picked up somebody last night from the filming who is going to add her master's research on from the landscape architecture approach to looking at well site management. Okay, so that's another field that we didn't have. So if there are more people out there that have information that could go into this paper, we would appreciate it. This is going to be an academic paper, but it's written for the general public. So we would invite any help from that standpoint. And with that, I'm going to come to an end, and I think we're ready for questions.
Okay, folks, give us just a moment. We're going to take a look at the chat box and see what questions are coming in from you all. It looks like we have a couple here to begin with. The first question: what is the difference between NORM and TENORM? And I'll just say the basic, what the acronyms stand for, and then I will defer or yield to Julie. So NORM is naturally occurring radioactive material. TENORM, technologically enhanced normally or naturally occurring radioactive material. And, you know, and it's also important to note, it depends on those two different terms can be defined differently depending on both the law in one state. So we've seen that with Ohio's budget bill. The way that these are characterized or defined is different from how, for example, the U.S. EPA defines those terms. I'm going to let Julie elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, the critical component is whose definition do you use? If you're using the U.S. EPA or the National Academy of Science or the ANSI terms, literally the entire waste stream that we have would be TENORM. But because we're using this old 1990 definition, we are only looking at a very, very small part of the waste stream and calling it TENORM. And we are only regulating that part of it. Everything else, no matter how radioactive it is, no matter how many heavy metals it has in it, no matter how much residual BTEX, which is benzene, ethyl, benzene, toluene, and xylene, how much of that is in there? It doesn't matter because it's NORM. We are not regulating it.
All right, so keep sending us your questions, folks, as we go along here. The second question we have: if an average well takes 5 million gallons to frack, how much is recovered for disposal or recycling? I'd like to let Julie answer this first, and then Teresa, we will, after Julie finishes, give you the microphone in case you'd like to add on. So how much of a 5 million gallon frack is recovered for disposal or recycling?
We've seen numbers as high as 80%, 20% is probably closer to reality. In Ohio, out of the 5 million, expect to get somewhere between 1 and 2 million gallons back.
And Teresa, anything you'd like to add to that? We just gave you the microphone.
No, I totally agree with Julie. The only caveat I have is that we are seeing some of the wells in Ohio that are taking 8, 10, 11, 12 million gallons to frack. So the 5 million may be the average, but we certainly have wells that are much higher than 5 million gallons.
Thank you, Teresa.
And I'd like to go back with Teresa saying part of the reason that the number is higher is because the horizontal sections are getting longer. When they started, the horizontal sections were about 2,000 to 3,000 feet. Now we have horizontal sections that are over a mile long. They're 6,000 to 7,000 feet long. And the longer they are, the more water it takes and the more fracking material it takes to frack them.
Great. Thanks, Julie, for adding that on. We have a third question, and keep sending your questions along. We've got plenty of time here to field folks' specific questions, more general questions. We have some great experts here, so we want to definitely use their time and tap into what they've got, the knowledge in their heads. So third question, if the rock solids are NORM, or naturally occurring radioactive material, why are they disposed of at landfills? Why not use them in land reclamation? We'll start with Julie, and then we'll then yield the microphone to Teresa if she would like to add on.
Well, I think at this point, even the state of Ohio realizes that this is material that they don't want just laying around. One of the critical components is what do you do with the waste at the end. And traditionally, we used to just simply bury the waste at the drilling sites and leave them there. But if you use this in land reclamation, even our current administration understands that there's the potential for leaching out of these materials and carrying it into the surface water and the groundwater. And I think that's a critical component, is that if you're just using it for land reclamation, if you've got any wells in the area, the potential for contamination for heavy metals and the radiologicals are very real. And so by at least putting them in the landfill, they're at least collected for this time, although the question is what happens to them for all time.
We'll give Teresa an opportunity if you'd like to add anything, Teresa.
Well, a couple of the studies that I have seen is that even under land reclamation, the stability, the waste is not stable enough structurally to be used as land reclamation. Some states were at one time considering it for road base, to use in building roads, and they found that it was not a stable material. But in the state of Ohio, the practice, they're still also using the practice of burying this waste on site.
Great, thank you, Teresa. Are there more questions from folks who might be on the line here, still with us? It looks like we've got another question, sort of a multi-part question, so bear with me. Let's see, so this question is around best practices to frack the well and around the current utilization of borons in fracking. So does the boron aid in capturing the radioactive shale? What are the pros and cons to the use of enzymes for defracking and site remediation? This is getting into some technicalities here and kind of a multi-part question. So I'm going to, again, just let Julie start us off with any initial reactions, responses to this question, and then we'll give Teresa a moment as well.
Okay, boron and fracking. Well, remember that from the brine and from the shale itself, you're going to get boron. Boron is part of the set of metals that are in the shale itself, and in the brine you already have boron there. I think perhaps this listener is referring to the idea of using boron as with sulfur as a precipitate. You can take a sulfate or sulfide and combine it with the fracking fluid at the end, and it'll drop out all of the +2 cations, the 2 valent cations. It'll drop out the calcium, the magnesium, and the boron. It doesn't actually drop out the radium. What happens is that the radium replaces the boron in the lattice, and so you get something called barite. It's a mineral called barite, and it's a solid form. And the radium has replaced the barite in that lattice structure. And now you've got the radium out of the fracking fluid or out of the of the brine, and you've got it in a solid form that then you can take to a low-level radioactive waste landfill. And actually, there are a number of folks that are using this process. So it is a good way to remove the radium and tie it up, but it's not cheap. And it's not something that we traditionally do as part of a wastewater treatment plant. So it isn't something that we would just normally do. But that may be part of the way to capture the radium and the uranium as we look at it once it's in our leachate in a landfill setting, or as we're pulling it out and we're reprocessing either the brine or the fracking fluid. And that is one method of doing it.
Let's give Teresa a moment. Teresa, any further reactions to the question around boron in fracking?
That is way out of my area of expertise, so I defer to Julie.
No problem. The same for me. It looks like we've had another question come in. Well, let's jump back to that one in a moment, Julie. Let's take a look at how do we get the public to accept the facts presented and prevent the oil and gas industry and politicians from distorting the issues. Well, that's a good question. It might be a question around sort of, you know, it's different organizations working on this issue. You know, we certainly have different strategies, different kind of campaign plans, different approaches to how we look at these issues. You know, we are trying to get information out there. That's why we're doing events like these, webinars, to bring the information to the public and to the media and to folks to kind of offer a counter or a full picture to what the industry public relations campaign puts out there, which is tends to be a rosier picture, a picture of the economic benefits, the sort of jobs figures, oftentimes high number jobs figures. And I'll just, while we're on the point and topic of outreach to the public and these webinars, we will be having a second webinar, part 2 of this series, next Friday, July 19th, 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. And we're actually going to be talking about sort of the economic realities of fracking. We will have Amanda Woodrum of Policy Matters talking about some of her initial economic analyses and research, doing surveys of some folks right there in Carroll County in the hotbed area of shale gas development here in Ohio. We'll also have Amanda Weinstein currently with Ohio State University, a research associate there, and she produced, co-authored a study that was a counter to industry's 200,000 number jobs figure to put out a 20,000, a much more modest sort of number around jobs and economic benefit around the industry. So at OEC, and of course Teresa with Buckeye Forest Council, you know, Julie doing her work with Bennett and Williams, we're trying to get out there and to present and share this information, and we can hope that it's taken by the public and used, and that the public then reaches out to their legislators and their decision makers to make an impact. But that is a very good question, one also difficult to answer. Teresa, would you like any opportunity to respond to that as well?
Well, I think with presentations such as this one, the way Julie presents this on a very layman's understandability level, I think, like I said, these types of webinars, educating the public, is what we're now beginning to do, and we're now beginning to understand a lot better, and we need citizens to be able to have more of these types of sessions, these webinars, you know, a traveling road show, so to speak, to educate the citizens that in turn need to be able to educate their legislators if the legislators had an open mind and didn't automatically dismiss citizens, that would be a big help.
Thanks, Teresa. We're going to take one final question, probably give this one to Julie, as it's a bit technical and around sort of the chemistry here. So one final question, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up today's webinar session. What are the pros and cons to the use of enzymes for defracking and site remediation? Julie.
Okay, yeah, this is a little technical, but when we look at site remediation, you've got all kinds of things there. You've got the petroleum byproducts, you've got the heavy metals, you've got the radioactive metals, you've got whatever may have been spilled of the materials that were used in the fracking. You've got the potential for just spills from the diesel and the lubricating oils and all the different things that get used on all of the machinery and all of the trucks that are there. And so if you have an accidental release at a site, you could have a whole plethora of contaminations that are there at the site that you would have to be able to remediate. I think the person that's asking this question is looking at the idea of using enzymes for bioremediation. And the answer is that they will work on some of these contaminants. They'll certainly work on the hydrocarbons pretty successfully. Where you get into the heavy metals and the radioactive metals, when you're dealing with those materials, one of the options is something called phytoremediation, which is using vegetation to absorb the heavy metals out of the soil, and then you have to dispose of the vegetation, because now you have vegetation full of radioactive materials or heavy metals. But the concern about going back and using those kinds of remediations on the site is that you need to make sure that you haven't waited so long that you've got off-site migration with plumes of contamination moving to the surface water or to the groundwater. So if I were going to be thinking about using those kinds of remediations on a site, I would also want to have monitoring points for the surface and the groundwater to make sure that I wasn't losing anything from the site as I use those kinds of approaches. Those approaches are usable. They can be done, but they need to be done holistically, looking at the potential for off-site migration while the remediation is taking place.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you for these great and thought-provoking questions. We want to thank you for signing up today for this webinar and for giving some time here this afternoon to learn about these important issues. I would like to encourage folks to sign up for part 2 of this series, again next Friday, July 19th, 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., Economics of Fracking. Remind folks that we have a registration and evaluation survey for you available in the chat box. A link is available in the chat box. You'll also receive a follow-up email with a link to that survey. That really helps us out. We'd greatly appreciate if you can take just 3 or 4 minutes to do that. We invite you to get involved with all of the organizations that have put on this webinar today. So Ohio Environmental Council, Buckeye Forest Council, and Center for Health, Environment, and Justice, Teresa's organizations, and take a look at Bennett and Williams and learn more about the work that they do and services that they provide to local communities. And also to let you know, there will be a recording and these PowerPoint slides online very soon, so you can take a look at our OEC website to find those if you had if you want to share this information. You'll be able to find those online. And we thank folks very much for being with us and encourage you to have a great weekend, and we hope that we'll hear and have some of you online with us next Friday at the same time. Thanks a lot, folks. Goodbye.